Hey, Saretsky here, back in the saddle after missing last week. I do apologize for the hiatus. My wife and I welcomed our first baby into this world, so took a much-needed week off last Friday, but back in the saddle this week. Wanted to touch on something that I get quite frequently in my inbox, calls. As you guys know, I've been selling real estate in the city of Vancouver here for the last 10 years. I've been documenting my thoughts on the housing market for the last 8 years, on this YouTube channel, on my blog, on my newsletter. I've been unpacking data. I've been chatting with developers, bankers, running through all the stats, built out a data platform for myself to sort of help analyze the market. And the biggest question I get from people as well, how do I time the market? When should I buy my primary residence? Should I wait 2 or 3 years, wait for the big crash to unfold, and then get into the market? As if they have some sort of foresight into where the market is going to be. And so there's something I want to unpack on that today and then walk you guys through some charts and data on my thoughts around the market and timing the market and really just investing in general. There's a great book that I read about a year and a half ago called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. It's probably one of my favorite books on personal finance, general investing. And one of the things what he said that was so brilliant was, you have to save like a pessimist, but invest like an optimist, right? Which is basically like, you got to save like a pessimist. Like there's always going to be a bad thing coming down the pipe on the horizon. There's always going to be some scary news that's out there. You always have to save like a pessimist for that rainy day. But at the end of the day, you have to invest like an optimist over the long run, because the reality is any financial market, real estate being one of them, is 9 times out of 10, the market is moving up and to the right. And so, this is a lot, again, part of that is a function of a currency debasement, the devaluation. Again, if you're getting 3% inflation, a lot of the gains you see, for example, in house prices, just your currency basically being debased consistently. And so 9 times out of 10, prices move higher. And so you have to invest like an optimist that things will be okay in the future. And so it always concerns me because, there's times where, I'll give you guys the negative outlook on housing and people say, hey, this guy's a perma bear and he's always Mr. Doomsday, don't buy and the market's going to crash. And it's really the last thing I'm encouraging. I think on your primary residence is that ultimately you should be buying when you can afford it, when you can actually afford it. You're not over leveraging yourself and it makes financial sense. And from a lifestyle perspective, it makes sense for you. And so one of the things I'd say around timing the market, like I think the last number of years should have been a really good learning lesson, which is like, we remember the foreign buyer tax and everyone's like, oh my God, the market's going to crash. We just brought in this 20% foreign buyer tax. Well, like what happened was like the market kind of dipped for about 6 months and then basically ripped higher. Condos the following year ripped 20% higher in 2017. We then had the pandemic, right, where we had, I think 18% of mortgages outstanding went into deferral in 2020. Everyone says, oh my gosh, everyone's deferring their mortgages. There's going to be this mortgage meltdown. Then, of course, the government pumped in billions and hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars of stimulus. House prices rocketed higher to record highs. National house prices in Canada, I think at one point were rising at a 28 or 29% annual basis, which is the fastest price growth in Canadian real estate history, dating back to data going back into the 80s. Okay, so you had the fastest price appreciation despite record job loss. We had record job loss in this country. The unemployment rate hit something like 10 or 11%. And again, 18% of people deferring their mortgages. Yet house prices went on the quickest tear we've ever seen. Fast forward to today, right? February 2022, the housing market peaks pretty much all across Canada. Peaked here in Vancouver in February of 2022. The Bank of Canada starts raising rates in March of 2022, and we go on to raise rates basically 500 basis points in a span of like 18 months, the fastest rate hiking cycle in modern history. When you adjust for the levels of indebtedness in the country. So you have basically this huge rip in house prices. House prices are at all-time record highs. You take interest rates from basically 0 to 5%. Mortgage rates go from basically 1.5% to 5.5%. And as it stands today, Greater Vancouver home prices, as measured from March of 2022 to today, the last reading, which was in April of 2024, if you look at the Greater Vancouver Home Price Index across all property types, we are down 4%. 4%, despite rates going, again, on their fastest tightening cycle in modern history. And so that personally has surprised me, right? I mean, if any of you guys were watching these videos, I said, hey, listen, back in the day, I said, there's no way Bank of Canada can raise rates. They're going to raise rates on record indebtedness in Canada, right? Household debt to GDP ratios through the roof, one of the most indebted countries in the G20, house prices at sky-high levels. There's no way they can raise rates to that height, keep them there without seeing, basically a housing meltdown. That was honestly my view. And here we are today, again, 4%. We've seen a 4% decline. And I can guarantee you that pretty much anyone watching this YouTube channel probably would have shared the relatively similar surprise as myself to see a 4% decline. Again, I would imagine minimum of 20% decline if you had reversed the tapes, 2, 3, 4 years ago, if you asked me if we had unfolded out this scenario. And so I can guarantee you Tiff Macklem at the Bank of Canada is probably thinking the same thing. He's probably scratching his head going, my goal was to raise rates very, very aggressively, slow the economy, get house prices to drop, get inflation back down to disinflation or deflation, and then begin cutting rates once again. And that just hasn't happened. And now we're this, what looks like higher for longer outlook. And so that just should really just show you ultimately how hard it is to predict. Again, the fastest tightening cycle, and we've seen a 4% decline. Now, don't get me wrong. There's, when we say, well, there's a lot of variables that have gone into play here, not only rates, but we look at, the rapid increase in population growth in Canada. That certainly, played a part, the lack of, you bring 1 million plus people a year into the country. There's a great chart here from the National Bank that just dropped showing, the ratio of growth in the working age population relative to housing starts. That deficit is the worst we've ever seen, with data going back to the 1970s. So that's certainly played a part. The federal deficits have played a part, but there's always, the macro is hard because the variables, the inputs are always changing. There's always something happening that can come in and impact markets, right? Just like, why did house prices not collapse during the pandemic? Well, they didn't collapse because the government printed trillions and trillions of dollars and ultimately overstimulated and basically debased the currency, and house prices lifted higher. So, but there's always those variables that are coming in, right? I mean, why haven't house prices crashed? Well, there's lots of variables. We just talked about the population growth. We can talk about the fact that people are negatively amortizing, where their interest, their mortgage balances are actually growing. They're adding interest to the balance of those mortgages in some cases. So there's a lot of factors. But again, these are just the realities that these markets are hard to predict because policies change, new governments form, things happen around the world that impact this. And so that's really what I would want to highlight. And again, there's, keep in mind, there is no national housing market as much as we'd like to talk about it. There's a lot of nuances individually. And so, there's a great chart here showing the change in home prices measured from February of 2022. If we look at various cities or municipalities, you look at, London, Ontario, you look at Kitchener, Ontario, you look at Hamilton, Ontario, those have already seen 30% declines adjusted in real terms, adjusted for rate of inflation. So those pockets have seen declines, but, moving forward, there's a multitude of outcomes. I always like to kind of unwind this a bit further and say, you have to look at the market independently and analyze for your own situation, what market are you trying to buy in, right? You can watch this video and it's like, well, listen, if you're buying in, Chilliwack, BC versus downtown Vancouver, those are two different markets, right? I mean, look at even in Vancouver here. So you have the east side and you have the west side. Houses on the east side, detached single-family houses on the east side of Vancouver, where all the density is happening, where all the young people are moving, those house prices effectively have doubled in the last decade. They have basically doubled in the last decade. Now you go to the west side of Vancouver, where the forward money has kind of dried up. There's just not a lot happening there. It's kind of been left for dead. These neighborhoods are kind of hollowing out a little bit. Those prices peaked in 2016, coinciding with the foreign investment boom that peaked in 2016. That detached land peaked in 2016, and it has gone virtually nowhere for coming up 8 years. It's been almost 8 years. Imagine if you told people on the east side that moving forward, maybe, east side peaked arguably in 2022 as well. Hey, you might end up being like the west side, and you might see no growth for the next 8 years. Potentially 10 years, right? I mean, in the 1990s, there was zero price growth in Vancouver real estate for a 10-year period. And so it's very possible that could be the outcome, right? I mean, look at condos in downtown Vancouver, pretty good real estate. Prime pandemic, ultimately peaked in 2018, along with the introduction of the mortgage stress test. And ultimately got hit along as well during the pandemic. And here we are in 2024. It's been 6 years where there's been no price growth. In fact, negative growth. If you bought in 2018 and you're selling today, you're selling at a loss. And so, again, 6 years of no growth. Is it possible that market goes another 4 years with no price growth? And again, another lost decade in parts of the market. So real estate is always hyper local. I don't believe in timing your primary residence. I think what you should do, if you want to get cute about it, is I try to encourage people to buy on sentiment or to sell on sentiment, which is like, you're never going to time tick the home price index. You're never going to be able to it looks like it's just bottoming now. I'm going to buy now, and then it's going to shoot higher. You're never going to be able to do that. But what you can do is you can buy when the sentiment is bad. So there was great opportunities when the foreign buyer tax came out in 2016 because the market froze. Everyone said, oh my God, this is going to kill the housing market. Prices are going to drop. They're going to crash dramatically. Everybody stepped back from the table, and there were some really good deals that were negotiated then. Same thing in the summer and fall of 2022 when Tiff Macklem was raising rates by 100 basis points at one single meeting in July of 2022. I remember because it was like a day after or 2 days after my wedding. I was on my honeymoon, and BNN Bloomberg says, hey, can you do a news interview for us? Tiff Macklem just raised rates 100 basis points. He just shocked the markets. The housing market was at a standstill. And the best deals that have been negotiated so far during this entire correction, albeit it's only a 4% correction, the best deals that were negotiated were in the depths of that rate hiking cycle, pretty much in the late summer, early fall of 2022, because the market was completely frozen. There was the odd seller that needed to get out. They needed the liquidity, and they had to sell. They had to sell to where the bid came in, and the bid came in very, very low in the summer and fall of 2022, and those have been, to date, the best prices that were negotiated. So basically, you have to invest like an optimism. Try to use sentiment as the gauge. The data points are great, but at the end of the day, it's like, I don't know where the market's going to be 6-12 months from now. I think you can assign probabilities to things, but I don't like the idea of people trying to time their primary residence, a place where you need to put a shelter and a roof over your family. Again, use sentiment, right? If all your neighbors are talking about buying real estate and buying investment properties, and there's 40 pairs of shoes at the front door of an open house in February of 2022, it should be pretty obvious that, hey, seems like we're in the midst of a frenzy. Maybe you don't want to be competing with 15 other people on being the top bidder. Maybe that's a time to pull back and wait it out. So I think you can really use these sentiment gauges ultimately. That's kind of how I wanted to frame up this week's video, continuing to watch the market again, as we always do every single week. Appreciate the support. We'll see you again next week.